With the growing humanitarian crisis at the border and the World Health Organization dismissing the idea that the coronavirus originated in a Wuhan lab, it seemed the perfect time to catch up with my first guest. He's the former U.S. Secretary of State under President Trump, now a distinguished fellow at the Hudson Institute, Mike Pompeo. Secretary Pompeo, thank you for being here. We currently have thousands of migrants packed into holding facilities, and more are coming across the U.S.-Mexican border. At his first press conference last week, President Biden claimed that years ago he had advocated this.
A bipartisan plan of over $700 million to do with the root causes of why people are leaving. What did Trump do? He eliminated that funding. He didn't use it. He didn't do it. And in addition to that, what he did, he dismantled all the elements that exist to deal with what had been a problem and has been continued to be a problem for a long time.
Secretary Pompeo, your reaction, and is Trump to blame for the surge here?
So I was intimately involved in executing President Trump's vision for securing our southern border and protecting and defending American sovereignty. To say that the folks that are coming across the border, the tragic video that we have seen from our border, to say that's because of something the Trump administration is, look, no one believes it as a first matter. It's just not true. This is because the Biden administration came in determined just to undo all things Trump or all things that Pompeo worked on. This is one of them. We'd worked with the Mexican government. We'd worked with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. We'd worked with their governments. We had the situation in a much better place than it has been in an awfully long time. And the national security crisis today on our southern border, the humanitarian crisis today on our southern border, now the health crisis on our southern border, those are all a direct result of decisions that this administration made. And the people trying to make that trek across the border are being savaged by cartels and by the coyotes are the true victims of it.
You were instrumental, as you mentioned there, putting in place that Remain in Mexico policy, also known as the Migrant Protection Policy, which allowed people to apply for asylum in the U.S. while remaining in Mexico or their country of origin. Now, President Biden ended that policy, but now it seems Vice President Kamala Harris is trying to restore it, no? Isn't that what she's tasked with doing?
I hope so. It was the right policy, and it worked for all of us. It worked for the Mexican government. It worked for us. Look, we negotiated long and hard. Myself and Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard of Mexico negotiated long and hard to get it right, to make it functional and work crisply in execution so that our great CBP officers could actually implement this. We wanted anybody with a valid asylum claim to have their fair shot, but we didn't want people coming across with claims that were going to be found invalid to be able to be here while they waited for their hearing. This made perfect sense. It was the kind of policy based on a realistic interpretation of the way the world really works that was the hallmark of what we tried to do in the Trump administration. And now they've undone. I hope they'll go back to it. I hope Vice President Harris goes back to it. I suspect that in the end, their progressive left won't let them do that.
What should they be doing? If you were advising them, what would you suggest they do?
I'd go back to status quo ex ante. I'd go back to the set of understandings and agreements that had been reached in the Trump administration. We had made the case clearly to these people who often live in difficult circumstances that says, no, come here lawfully and only lawfully. Don't try and make this journey across Mexico. It's not safe. It's not healthy, and you won't get in. And to have an immigration policy that's rooted in sovereignty, rooted in the rule of law. If they go back to those things, these terrible images that you see at our southern border will once again recede.
This week, a World Health Organization China study on the origins of COVID-19 claims the transmission of the virus from bats to humans through another animal is the most likely scenario, and that a lab leak is, quote, extremely unlikely. Now, that report's based on a visit by a WHO team of international experts to Wuhan and may have been partially written by the Chinese government. Do you accept this interpretation? I mean, even the Biden administration is dubious about these claims.
There's no reason to think that this was an independent investigation. The Chinese had the veto rights on who could be part of the team. The team basically interviewed Chinese people who were handpicked by the Chinese Communist Party and got second and third hand information from them. They didn't get access to the original virus. They didn't get thorough access to the lab that we suspect may well have been the source for the virus spreading. I've called it a sham. This isn't a report anybody should pay a heck of a lot of attention to. I think the Chinese know that. It's why they're defending it so vigorously. And it's why they're continuing to cover up what really happened in Wuhan that caused now millions of deaths across the world and billions of dollars in lost wealth, making lots of people a lot poorer than they would have been.
The other day when I saw this next story, I thought of you instantly, was delighted we were having you on the show this week. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, your successor, issued a report on human rights this week. He took the occasion to call out the Trump administration and your office for what he called your unbalanced view of human rights, particularly, Mike Pompeo, your prioritization of religious rights. Listen.
Human rights are also co-equal. There is no hierarchy that makes some rights more important than others.
Your thoughts, Secretary Pompeo. He seemed particularly upset by your unwillingness to place women's reproductive health and LGBT rights on the same level as religious and human rights.
Yes, Raymond, this is a bit of sleight of hand by the administration. They know full well that the very rights that we created a commission to go back and study the history of human rights and the foundation of human rights here in the United States and indeed around the world. What they're trying to do is use a bit of sleight of hand to refuse to acknowledge that rights aren't granted by governments. They are inherent in each of us as human beings, and as our founders understood, granted to us by God. And they want to do it differently. They want to have a legislature give you rights. We know this, Raymond. If the legislature gives you the rights, they can just as easily take them away. No, what we were focused on in the Trump administration were the central understandings that each human being is created in the image of God, and that in fact the rights that are inherent in each of us aren't given to us by the niceties of some political entity. When they get to talking about women's health and reproductive rights, they're really talking about abortion. They're really talking about their fundamental focus on making sure that there are babies that are not born. It's unfortunate that they're headed down this path. Every single human being deserves to be protected from the moment that they are created, the moment that they are conceived till their natural death. And this administration has undone all of the good pro-life work that the Trump administration did.
Well, and that prioritization and focus on religious rights that had languished for so long, Secretary Pompeo, and you see that, you're beginning to see that in the policy. This is no longer a major talking point on the forefront of these conversations with our enemies and abroad.
And it's too bad, because nations around the world appreciated the fact that America under President Trump was determined to expand the scope of people to practice their own faith. Raymond, I was often dealing with counterparts who weren't Christian, who were from different countries, whether they were Muslim countries or Israel, the Jewish homeland. These were countries, but they were disciplined, faithful believers. And the fact that the United States was so committed to making sure that we did all that we could to make sure every human right had the right to practice their own faith, or if they chose no faith at all, was something countries around the world really valued, and it benefited us here in the United States at home as well. It's unfortunate that they have now sought to put religious freedom as a second or third tier right. Our founders understood differently. The First Amendment is first for that very reason.
Yeah. Last week, North Korea tested 2 short-range missiles off its eastern coast in the first such launches since Biden took office. President Biden reacted this way.
We're consulting with our allies and partners, and there will be responses if they choose to escalate. We will respond accordingly. But I'm also prepared for some form of diplomacy, but it has to be conditioned upon the end result of denuclearization.
Secretary Pompeo, what do these missile launches tell you about the Northern Korean view of the world at the moment? And is this response by Biden forceful enough?
Well, I hope the Biden administration gets this right. These missile launches violated the UN Security Council resolutions that we worked so hard to put in place. There has to be a cost for that activity. It ought to be a collective one. That would be good in the first instance. But as President Trump made clear, when America needs to act and act alone, because it's the right thing to do, we should do it. I didn't hear from him any indications what he's thinking about in terms of responding should the North Koreans conduct such attacks again. I'm hopeful the North Koreans will follow down the path that we had begun towards denuclearization. There's an awful lot of work left to do. President Trump took over when you'll remember, Raymond, everyone will remember fire and fury. Tensions were incredibly high. Tensions were incredibly high, and we managed to create the conditions to reduce the risk that North Korea would have the capability and to reach the United States and the desire to do such a thing.
Secretary Blinken has confirmed that the Biden administration reached out to North Korea without a response. And for the record, the Trump administration was able to get North Korea to cease those long-range missile tests. But it seems they feel renewed now and emboldened.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt. New administration, they're going to test them. They're going to see how far they can push the administration. They tried to do the same thing in ours. We met steel with steel. We made clear to them it was going to be costly for them to engage in this activity. If this administration will do the same, if this administration is strong and tough and responds appropriately and not with appeasement, I'm confident they can get to the same place we did. Your point's well taken. We went twice to have the president meet with Chairman Kim. They were historic meetings. And we managed to convince Chairman Kim not to conduct long-range nuclear missile tests or conduct the nuclear tests themselves. Those were good things. They reduced risk not only to the United States, but to the world.
I think people fail to understand, Secretary Pompeo, the linkage between Northern Korea and China and how the United States' relationship with both parties affects the outcomes here. Now, China has become increasingly aggressive. We've seen the clampdown on democracy in Hong Kong, their horrendous human rights record, the Uyghurs being imprisoned. Prior to leaving your position as the Secretary of State, you determined that China was committing genocide against the Uyghur Muslims. Why did you wait until your last week of office to make that determination? And how should this administration deal with China when it comes to Uyghurs and all these other religious minorities being persecuted therein?
Raymond, I regret that we weren't able to complete that task sooner. It was really important. Making a determination of genocide is something we don't do often here in the United States. And when we do, it deserves a fair amount of care and thoughtfulness. I wanted every voice to be heard inside the State Department. Ultimately, there were a lot of people in the State Department that didn't think it was the right decision. I did, and so I made that call. The fact that it was so late in the administration shouldn't deny the facts. The facts are that they were and continue to commit genocide against Uyghur populations, mostly Muslim, but other faiths as well. Uzbeks, Kazakhstanis in Western China today. This is a genocide that begins to look like what happened in Germany in the 1930s, and no one should do business with people who are executing slave labor in Western China. I hope every American company will take that responsibility seriously.
We often hear the phrase "never forget," but we forget about what's happening right now in the world, and with a partner. China collaborates with so many of these American companies, and they just blithely go on as if nothing's happening, and that there aren't religious, racial, and ethnic cleansing going on at this moment. It really is astounding. It's mind-boggling, but I suppose it's the power of money, Secretary Pompeo. By the way, do you support the boycotting of the Olympics in China over that human rights record?
I do. I hope that the International Olympic Committee will get it right and they will move the games from there. But in the event that they don't, in the event that they choose to allow the Chinese Communist Party to host an Olympic Games while they are committing genocide in the western part of their country, which harkens us back to the games in Germany in the 1930s. If the IOC moves forward with that, it's not the case that the U.S. Olympic Committee ought to feel good about going there. No American athlete should want to travel to that country where if they said something about the free people of Hong Kong, they'd be subject to arrest. This is not a place that ought to be hosting American athletes. It's not the right thing to do. And in the event the IOC gets it wrong, we ought not to let our athletes travel there.
You were very outspoken, Secretary Pompeo, before the Vatican was set to renew that agreement with China that they signed. You said at the time that the Vatican, quote, endangers its moral authority by considering an extension of that 2018 agreement with China on the nomination of bishops, giving the Chinese Communist Party the permission to choose bishops, and then the Vatican would either accept them or not. Seeing what's happened to Christians there, what do you make of the Vatican's decision to renew that agreement? And are you surprised by the virtual silence we're hearing from them as we see these stories of persecution coming out of Hong Kong and other places within China?
The Pope a few weeks back made his first reference to what's taking place in Western China. Good on him for that. I was vociferous in trying to make the case that the church, the Catholic Church, all churches have a special responsibility. Governments have a duty, but churches have a moral authority that comes with the clarity about speaking truth about what's really happening, and truth about those who are actually permitted to practice their faith. In the Catholic tradition, the Catholic Church has often been on the right side of history with respect to freedom and liberty and the most fundamental right to practice one's faith. In this case, I think the Catholic Church has it wrong. I think the Vatican's decision to allow the Chinese Communist Party to be involved in the selection of who the faith leaders will be almost certainly means that the Chinese Communist Party will be controlling the practice of that faith. That's not healthy for the faith. It's not helpful for the moral witness of churches around the world.
Secretary Mike Pompeo, thank you for being here. A happy Easter to you, and we'll check in the days ahead.
Thank you, Raymond. You have a blessed Easter as well. So long.